Today we're going to be talking about absolute value equations. This is in section 3.7. This isn't the only thing in 3.7, but this is going to be the first thing we talk about. So if you look at the top of your notes here, with absolute value equations, we need to kind of remind ourselves what it means to be an absolute value. So on this left-hand side here, you see where it says the absolute value of A, and it kind of splits it, the absolute value of A equals B, and then it kind of splits it apart. Now, absolute value, there's a couple ways you can think about it, but the best way to think about absolute value is distance from zero. So whenever we talk about absolute value, that's how we want to think about it. So if the absolute value of A equals B, there's two things that it could be, and it splits it apart into A equal could be B, or A could be negative B. So this is going to be a little easier to think about if we actually look at maybe some numbers. So for example, over here, where it says the absolute value of x equals 10, well, it says, well, x could either be 10 or x could be negative 10. So if we think about, like I said, think about this as distance from 0. So if I start at 0, it says that the absolute value of something is 10. This means that something is 10 steps away from 0. So if I start at 0 and I go to the right 10 places, I would end up with positive 10. Or I could start at 10 and I could go to the left and I'd end up at negative 10. So that's where this 10 and negative 10 comes from. Okay, could be two different things. Could be positive 10 or it could be negative 10. So let's go ahead, let's jump into some examples and let's see how these go. We're going to do 10 of these actually. So if you want to split your paper into 10 boxes, may have to write kind of small for some of them. Now notice that since absolute value is distance from 0, it looks like probably going to have two answers for most of these. It's not always guaranteed, but for most of them you are going to end up with two answers. So first one, let's look at this. If the absolute value of B equals 2/3, okay, so keep in mind this means that something B, it's 2/3 steps away from 0. So we don't have to do a graph, but sometimes it's kind of nice to think about it. So if I start at 0 and I go 2/3 to the right, I would end up at positive 2/3. So that's one of my answers. Or I could start at 0 and I could go 2/3 to the left and I'd end up with negative 2/3. So there's where your two answers come from, 2/3 and negative 2/3. These first ones are going to be pretty easy. What if I have the absolute value of n plus 2 equals 5? Okay, these ones, if you notice what's different about this one is that I have the absolute value of n, and then I've got this plus 2 here. I cannot have that plus 2 there. So the first thing that you have to do, and it's actually what it says up there in your writing, you have to isolate the absolute value first. So we're going to solve for that absolute value of n, just like if it was a regular equation. So to get rid of that 2, we're going to subtract 2 from both sides. So now I have the absolute value of n equals 3, which means whatever n is, I know it's 3 steps away from 0. So we know that the absolute value of n, it could be 3 or it could be negative 3. Okay, let's try this one. What if I have 4 equals the absolute value of s minus 3? Okay, kind of like in the last one, I have to have this absolute value of s all by itself. So I got to get rid of the minus 3. To do that, we're going to plus 3 on both sides. So I have 7 equals the absolute value of s. So now we're thinking, okay, well, what is 7 steps away from 0? Well, we could go to the right and be at positive 7, or we could go to the left and be at negative 7. And let's do one more of these easy ones. Okay, if I have 7 times the absolute value of d equals 49. Okay, once again, I have to isolate that absolute value of d, so I need to get rid of the 7. Now this time, it's 7 times d, so to get rid of the 7 times, we're going to divide both sides by 7. So now I have the absolute value of d equals 7, which means d could either be 7 or it could be negative 7. So those ones, pretty easy, not too bad. What I want you to notice is that the only thing in the absolute value bars is my variable. So I can split it apart and I can just say, okay, well, these are my two answers, the positive and negative answers. The rest of them aren't going to be quite so easy. The rest of them are going to look something like this. if I have the absolute value of r minus 9 equals 3. Now the idea is still the same. Something has an absolute value of 3, meaning something is 3 steps away from 0. Whatever's inside here is 3 steps away from 0. Or whatever is inside here, well, we know if it has an absolute value of 3, it could be 3 or it could be negative 3, right? Because the absolute value of 3 is 3. The absolute value of negative 3 is 3. So what this tells me is that r minus 9, it could be 3, or r minus 9 could be negative 3. So I have my two equations, and if I go through to solve both of these equations, in the first one we'd add 9 to both sides, and I'd get r equals 12. For the second one, add 9 to both sides, we'd get r equals 6. Now what I want to point out is that if you plug both of these into the equation, they're going to work. So if I plug in 12, I get the absolute value of 12 minus 9 equals 3. Well, guess what? 12 minus 9, that is 3. And the absolute value of 3 is 3. And if I plug in 6, it should work as well. So the absolute value of 6 minus 9 equals 3. Well, 6 minus 9 is negative 3. And guess what? The absolute value of negative 3, it's 3. So they both work. Okay, let's try another one of those. What if I have the absolute value of c plus 13 equals 15? Okay, kind of like in the last one, this tells me that something has an absolute value of 15. Whatever's inside here is 15 steps away from 0. So we know that whatever's inside here could be 15 or it could be negative 15 because both of those numbers have an absolute value of 15. So that tells me that c plus 13 could equal 15 or c plus 13 could equal negative 15. And just like the last one, we can go through and solve both of these. So subtract 13 from both sides, we'd get c equals 2. Subtract 13 from both sides, we'd get c equals negative 28. And kind of like the last one, if you plugged both of those into your original equation, both of them should work. Okay, the next one. If I have 2 equals the absolute value of m plus 2/3. Okay, so my absolute value is isolated. This tells me that whatever's inside here has an absolute value of 2. And we know that the two numbers that have an absolute value of 2 are 2 and negative 2. So this tells me that m plus 2/3 could equal 2, or m plus 2/3 could equal negative 2. So there's my two equations. So for the first one, if I subtract 2/3 from both sides, we'd get 1 and 1/3. If I subtract 2/3 from the right-hand equation, we'd get negative 2 and 2/3. So there's your two answers. Okay, one more. This one's kind of different. Okay, this one looks like this. This one says negative 2 times the absolute value of 3d equals 4. Okay, first of all, what I want you to notice is my absolute value. It's not isolated because I've got that negative 2. So just like we did in the first 4 equations, I've got to isolate my absolute value first. So I've got to get rid of that negative 2. Well, this says negative 2 times. So we're going to divide both sides by negative 2. So I have the absolute value of 3d equals negative 2. Now this poses a problem because this tells me that something has an absolute value of negative 2. This tells me that something is negative 2 steps away from 0. Now, since we're talking about a distance, we're not going to worry about direction. Even if I'm going to the left, we just say, okay, we're going to walk to the left. We don't say we're walking negative 2 steps. So what this tells me is absolute value, it can never, ever be negative. So when this tells me that the absolute value of something is negative 2, I automatically know that there's no solution. And if you're thinking, well, maybe it could be 2, okay, well, think about the absolute value of 2. Well, that equals 2. And you're like, well, maybe it could be negative 2. Well, the absolute value of negative 2 is also 2. So notice, there's no number in the world that has an absolute value of negative 2, which is where we get this answer of no solution. Okay, a couple more. Let's try 3 times the absolute value of d minus 4 equals 12. Okay, kind of like the last one, I've got to get rid of that d. So this is 3 times the absolute value of d minus 4. So divide both sides by 3. we'd have the absolute value of d minus 4 equals 4. Okay, now that the absolute value is isolated, I'm ready to split it up into my two equations. So this has an absolute value of 4, which means whatever is inside here could be a 4 or a negative 4. So it tells me that d minus 4 could equal 4, or d minus 4 could equal negative 4. And then we have our two equations to solve, so add 4, we get d equals 8. Add 4, we get d equals 0. And once again, if you were to plug these two answers back into this original equation, both of them would work. Okay, and the last one, let's do the absolute value of 3f plus 0.5, and then on the outside minus 1 equals 7. Okay, notice my absolute value, it's not isolated. I have to get rid of that minus 1. So to get rid of the minus 1, we add 1 to both sides. So I have the absolute value of 3f plus 0.5 equals 7. Once your absolute value is isolated, go ahead and split it up into the two equations. So this tells me that something has an absolute value of 7. Well, the two numbers that have an absolute value of 7 are 7 and negative 7. So this tells me that 3f plus 0.5 could equal 7, or 3f plus 0.5 could equal negative 7. Okay, now I have a two-step equation. Doesn't matter, you do it the same way. Subtract 0.5 from both sides. So I'd have 3f equals 6.5. Divide both sides by 3. Should give me 2.5. And on the right-hand equation, if I subtract 0.5 from both sides, we'd have 3f equals negative 7.5. Divide both sides by 3, and if you punch that in your calculator, it should give you negative 2.83, and that 3's going to repeat.